All these things through Christ. Amen. Okay, well, we began last week with a pretty rough historical trip, if you will. Of course, the Bible is our primary text, and it's always accurate. But certainly a lot of these facts we get from uninspired historians. And just for your information, a lot of this information that we're going over comes from the apocryphal books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and then several historians, Herodotus, Philo, Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, Josephus, and others that you are, I'm sure, familiar with. Last week we talked about really a little bit of the history of the nation of Israel, beginning with Moses. We looked at the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, and then a little bit about Egypt, which always seemed to play a role in the history of the Israelite people. And then we mentioned Assyria, which was the great empire before those that we're really dealing with in the book of Daniel. The Assyrians were the great threat to the nation of Israel for a couple of hundred years. And you recall the preaching of Jonah, and the Assyrians, the Ninevites repented, Nineveh being the capital of Assyria. But by 150 years later, Nahum comes along in his prophecy and says, well, God's judgment is coming, no ifs, ands, or buts upon this nation. You recall the Assyrians took the northern tribes into captivity in about 722, 721 BC, and even threatened the southern nation of Judah at one time, Sennacherib, of course, besieging Jerusalem. But Christ intervened and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers and sent him home, whereupon he was murdered by two of his sons approximately 17 years later. But at any rate, that got us down to, we actually began then with the Babylonians. Well, we also mentioned, of course, that when the Assyrians took the northern tribes into captivity, they of course replaced those peoples with others they brought from other parts of that part of the world, and probably then is what developed into the mixed race of people between Jew and Gentile that we come to know in the New Testament as the Samaritans. That got us to then the first major empire that the book of Daniel focuses on, the Babylonians. And we're looking at four major empires in the book of Daniel, two of which Daniel lived in, the Babylonian and then the Medo-Persian. But then he prophesied not only about those two kingdoms, but also the kingdoms of Greece, both united and divided, and then, of course, the Roman Empire and into the first century and the church. And so that's really where our focus needs to be. And we noticed that the prophecies of Daniel began in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar really was the greatest king as far as the Babylonians were concerned. He's the one that built the Babylonian Empire. He conquered the Assyrians. They, of course, took Nineveh in about 612 BC and totally defeated the Assyrians in about 609. But then it was in 597, we mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar made his first incursion into Judea and took away, not 597, 606 BC, his first incursion. And he took Daniel and some of the seed royal, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, into Babylonian captivity. He comes back in 597. He takes a couple of famous folks, Ezekiel the prophet and Jehoiachin, the rightful king, also known as Jeconiah or Coniah in Scripture. And then we talked quite a bit about that. Then he comes back in 586 and he totally destroys the city, tears down the walls, burns the temple and so forth, and carries the rest of the folks into Babylonian captivity except for the poorest of the land. And there's a few more Babylonian kings, not as great as Nebuchadnezzar, until you get down to Nabonidus, the last king, who also perhaps made his son Belshazzar a vice-regent or viceroy, as he tended to be away a lot And it was this Belshazzar that was ruling in Babylon. When we go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 28, and we notice the handwriting on the wall, and that night Belshazzar was slain by the Medes and Persians, and his kingdom was divided and given to them, Daniel chapter 5, verse 28. Now, the question was raised after class last week, how far is it? This is that map that we had showing perhaps some possible routes of deportation and return. This one up here would have been the northern tribes. But how far is it from Jerusalem to Babylon over here? And so I did a little looking on, where else? The internet. From what I could tell from most sources, if you could go as the crow flies across the Arabian desert, which of course you would not, probably a little over 500 miles. But if you go this way, see, here's Haran. Anybody remember what Haran is famous for? Who ended up in Haran after he was told to leave Ur of the Chaldees? Abraham did. Abraham was down here in Ur. Here's Ur. Traveled to Haran, I believe where his father died. And then he came down into Palestine. If you go this route along the Fertile Crescent there, which you pretty much have to for water sources, you're probably looking at over 900 miles. Turn over to Ezra chapter 7. Well, if you turn, I'm not going to turn over, I've already read it. Turn to Ezra chapter 7. You look at verses 1 through 10. Now, Ezra, when he returned in 457 to rebuild, Nehemiah rebuilt the wall. Ezra came back to reinstall the law. When Ezra returned, it says there in Ezra chapter 7, it took him how long in his group? It tells you how long it took. From the beginning of one month to the beginning of another month, if you count it, it's about 4 months. Now, I don't know if those months correspond exactly to hours. I read where that probably was more like 3.5 of hours, but somewhere between 3.5 and 4 months. But you understand his group had women, children, livestock. I'm sure they traveled in the mornings and in the evenings, not in the heat of the day. So it took them a while. If you had a well-trained veteran army, Nehemiah, when he went back in 444, if you go to Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah says he traveled back with who? He traveled back with a bunch of women and children? Horsemen and soldiers. If you were traveling with horsemen and soldiers, probably about a third of the time, I would guess. That's just based on my knowledge of Civil War history. A veteran Civil War army could cover probably a good 20 to 25 miles a day on foot. I suspect about a third of the time for them. But anyway, interesting question. Probably a good 800 or 900 miles going around the Fertile Crescent as opposed to straight across the Arabian desert. So that gets us down to our next empire, the Medes and Persians. And it plays a prominent role in the Bible. And so we need to spend a little time on it. And as I told you last week, you can't make some of this stuff up. I mean, you just can't. It's better than a movie. Because we're going to focus on Cyrus the Great, Cyrus II. Anytime you read the name of a person in history whose name ends in the Great, you need to pay attention. Because not too many people get that designation. Alexander the Great, right? Cyrus the Great. I don't know, I think there's maybe only one English monarch in their history called the Great. Who was that? English, in about 800 or 900 AD. The one who unified the British Isles into one country. Alfred the Great. I don't know if there's any other English monarchs called the Great. So not too many people get called the Great. So if they're called the Great, they did something great, more than likely. Medo-Persian actually is Median Persian. There are a lot of similarities between the Median and Persian peoples. They were similar in culture. Each lived to the east of the Tigris and north of the Persian Gulf. Here's the Persian Gulf, and let's see, here's the Tigris up here. Nineveh was on the Tigris. And they actually lived east, okay? You see the Caspian Sea? See, here's Media. So, you've got, they lived in around the Zagros mountain range. Media went further north to the Caspian. Persia spread further east, roughly halfway to the Indus River, and each both used cuneiform for writing, had a similar cultural heritage, Indo-European, and had same enemies like Babylon, Nineveh, and others. So, we mentioned that Nineveh falls in 612 to a combined army composed of Babylonians, and we said actually the Babylonians were Chaldeans, led by Nabopolassar, that was Nebuchadnezzar's father, Scythians, who dwelt along the northern coast of the Black Sea, and led by a guy by the name of Arbaces, and the Medes were led by a king named Cyaxares. Cyaxares ruled from 625 to 585 BC very successfully, and when he died, his son Astyages gained the throne. Now this is where it gets crazy. Astyages reigned from 585 to 550, but Astyages was upset because he had a potential rival. You say, well, who was his rival? His rival was his unborn grandson. He dreamed that his daughter, and I don't know how you pronounce her name, if it's Mandane or Mandani, who would have a son who would rule Asia. And so he concocted a plan to wed her to the king of Persia, Cambyses. At the time, Media was a greater nation than Persia. That would change. But Astyages thought, well, I'll get the threat away from me and it'll be their problem. A son is born to Cambyses and the daughter Mandani. And he has another dream, Astyages does, so he's getting really worried about this grandson. So he sends a man by the name of Harpagos to kill his newborn grandson. He's a nice fellow, Astyages. But Harpagos couldn't do it, and so he passes the child off to a herdsman named Mithridates, whose wife had a stillborn child, and they decided to raise the child as their own. Gave it a name of some sort. But eventually the child was given back to Cambyses and his wife. So in 559, Cambyses dies and his son takes the throne. But back in Media, Astyages finds out his grandson's alive. So he punishes Harpagos by doing what? Anybody know? He kills Harpagos' son and serves it to him for dinner without telling him what he's eating. Harpagos finds out about this and decides to take revenge. And so he maneuvers himself in close to the Persian king so he can be near Cambyses' heir. And when the appropriate time arrives, he sends a note to this child that's now growing up and says, his note says, "Son of Cambyses, the gods are watching over you." Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 44. We'll get there in just a second. Isaiah 44. The gods are watching over you, otherwise you could never have come into such good fortune. Now is the time to take revenge on Astyages, who chose to be your murderer. For it was his will that you were to be killed, but by the will of the gods and myself you are alive. I suppose that you have known for a long time of what I did for you and of how I've suffered at the hands of Astyages, because I did not kill you, but instead gave you to the herdsman. I don't know what his name was given to him by the herdsman and his wife. But the Bible gives this grandson a name, and God called his name 200 years before he comes to the throne. Look in Isaiah 44, verse 28. Oops, turned too far. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to His anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors so that the gates will not be shut, and so forth. This is the grandson of Astyages that he tried to kill. Harpago said, the gods are watching over you. He was partly right. There was one God watching over Cyrus, and he called him by name 200 years before his reign. And as I said, he's called the Great for a reason. But if you go into Daniel 2, we know that the Medes and Persians were those arms of silver. What's the difference between silver and gold? Now, Babylon's the head of gold. Give me a couple of differences between silver and gold. Yeah, they're two metals, but what's the difference? If I had to give you a couple of differences between the two metals, and don't tell me the color. Value is one. Gold is worth more than silver. What's the other? And gold is softer. So silver is actually stronger than gold. Gold is more valuable, but silver is stronger. And so look at, let's go to Daniel chapter 7. And let's see what Cyrus did. Of course, Cyrus is most important to us and our study and the children of Israel. Why? What did he do? According to Ezra chapter 1, what did he do? He allowed the children of Israel to return from captivity and to start rebuilding the temple. But look at Daniel chapter 7, verse 3. Daniel spoke, I saw in my vision by night, verse 2, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, that's Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Now look at verse 5. And suddenly, another beast, a second like a bear. Well, a bear is a pretty ferocious animal, is it not? Especially when it's raised up. Raised up on one side, indicating the difference between the Medes and the Persians. One started out more prominent, but the other came on later. And had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. Now, it's interesting that Cyrus was both Median and Persian through his father and his mother. But he conquered 3 nations. Notice there's 3 ribs in this bear's mouth. And he conquered 3 peoples. Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. All were conquered by Cyrus the Great. And as much as I'd like to skip some of this, I can't skip this. And so I'm going to tell you about just an example of his conquering of Lydia. The capital of Lydia was Sardis. Anybody remember the name Sardis as a city? Revelation, one of the 7 churches of Asia. Croesus was her king, and he had been an ally of Astyages, and so Cyrus obviously saw Lydia as an enemy and went to war. Croesus was a pretty greedy fellow, liked his money, and he relied heavily upon mercenaries, as a lot of kings did, Greeks and others. Winter was coming on, so he decided he'd save the money and sent the mercenaries home because he figured nobody fights in the winter, Cyrus will not attack. Well, as soon as he let the mercenaries go home in order to save money, what does Cyrus do? He attacks. Herodotus says regarding Cyrus, he immediately acted on his decision and drove his army into Lydia so rapidly that he needed no messenger to bring the news of the event to Croesus. He brought it himself. But here's the interesting part, how the city fell. Toward the end of a 14-day siege, and Sardis was seemingly impregnable. It was built on an acropolis. A Persian soldier noticed a Lydian soldier drop his helmet from the steep rock face And he watched as this fellow took a narrow path down the rocks to get his helmet. And so the next day, this soldier and some others climbed the obscure route and began the final assault, which took the city. They found the way in by watching this guy retrieve his helmet. And so it's interesting when you go to Revelation chapter 3, verse 3, regarding Jesus' warning to the church at Sardis. What did he say? He would come on them as a thief, and you will not know what hour I come upon you. Do you think that the members of the church at Sardis, and I think people back then had a much greater appreciation of their history than perhaps we do. But do you think that the people in the church at Sardis, when Jesus said, I'm going to come upon you as a thief and you won't know what hour I show up, do you think they might have appreciated that a little bit? Knowing how that Sardis was taken by Cyrus? Cyrus was going to burn Croesus on a big, massive funeral pyre. And as the fire was burning, for some reason he changed his mind and decided to make Croesus his friend. This story has nothing to do with anything, it's just funny. So they're sitting there watching the Persian soldiers plunder Sardis. And Cyrus the Great turns to Croesus and says, you know, you're taking this awful well. I mean, you know, it doesn't seem to be bothering you too much that my soldiers are plundering your city. And he said, well, to be honest with you, I'm paraphrasing, it's not my city anymore, it's yours. So they're plundering your city. At that point, the plundering stopped. So Cyrus had his soldiers stop tearing things up, which was a good point. There were several attempts on Cyrus's life, but he did unite Media and Persia under his rule, of course, taking Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. But became, most of all for our purposes, the Lord's shepherd, as he calls him in Isaiah 44. You go to 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra chapter 1, and you get the culmination of Isaiah's prophecy when he released the Jews after their 70 years of captivity. He died quelling a revolt in the eastern part of Persia in about 530 BC, and his tomb actually still stands. The Jews went into Babylonian captivity, and out of Babylonian captivity came what two things, really, probably, as far as our purposes. Number one, they were cured of their idolatry. That was the purpose of captivity. But more than likely, of course, synagogue worship developed during Babylonian captivity. What's famous about the Persians? What do we know about them from the book of Daniel? What about their law? And from Esther, for that matter. The law doesn't change. No, in fact, no one's above the law. Even the ruler like a Cyrus or a Darius or others, if you go to Daniel or to Esther, Xerxes, Ahasuerus, if they made a decree, they couldn't undo it. So, another one of those things that contributed to the fullness of time from Galatians chapter 4. And quickly to finish out the Persians, there was a lot of infighting after the death of Cyrus. Cambyses II ruled next, his son. He murdered his brother, Barduja or Smerdis. And he continued fighting against Egypt, went as far as Ethiopia. He learned that a usurper was taking the throne. And I never really understood this. There's some historians that say upon learning of the usurper taking the throne back in Persia, he killed himself. I don't know why he'd kill himself if he had an army with him. But others, historians say he just died on the way back, mounting a horse, and then others say he had epilepsy and insanity. But we don't know really what happened to Cambyses II. But the usurper's name was Gamada, and pretending to be the brother of Cambyses, and so therefore he was called by historians Pseudo-Smerdis. And he was eventually killed, but it's probably this Gamada that is the Artaxerxes of Ezra chapter 4, verse 7, who ordered what? What happened in Ezra after they got a good start on the temple? You remember the people of the land sent a letter back, and the Persian monarch ordered them to stop, and it stopped for a good 15 years. And it could have been this Gamada that stopped the building of the temple. Some other relatively insignificant kings, till you get down to Darius Hystaspes, Darius the First Hystaspes, also known as Darius the Great. It was in his reign that the temple was rebuilt and finished in about 515 BC. And his capital was at Susa. And we know Susa from our biblical text as what city? What do we call Susa? In the Bible it's called Sushan. There's Susa right there. But when you read Sushan in the Bible, it's talking about Susa. But the temple was rebuilt under his reign. Now, this next guy is pretty important. By the way, Danny, just put up I forget, what's the next slide? I think that's the return. Yeah, this is I just threw this in there for interest. This kind of shows the region of settlement of the Jews after they returned from Babylonian captivity. All right? And just gives you an idea. Samaria's up here. You know, they were always coming down and causing them problems. Let's go to the next slide, Danny. All right, Persian Empire. That's what we're talking about anyway. Here's Lydia. I told you Cyrus the Great took Lydia. He took Egypt. He took Babylon. Let's see. Purple. Cyrus took all of that. He took this. He took all of that, pretty much. I mean, he's the one that took most of that. They show this being taken by Cambyses, but he actually took Egypt too. Now, Cambyses did go to Egypt and continue fighting down there. Cyrus pretty much is the one that built the Persian Empire. As you can see, it stretches all the way from India, Indus River, all the way to Greece. And so Darius' son, Xerxes I, reigned from 485 to 465. This is probably our biblical Ahasuerus from the book of Esther. He took the throne and divided his kingdom into 127 satrapies. And I like what Brother Cates has in his material, that the book of Esther is really the tale of two Xerxes. You open the book of Esther in chapter 1, he seems to be a despot, really, right? He has a banquet, 6 months long, whatever it was, and his wife won't do what he says, and so what does he do to Vashti? He deposes her. But later in the book, when he finally settles on a new wife, on Esther, he really doesn't seem to be the same guy. He seems to be much more tender and kind. He even saves her people at her request. What's the change in allowing the Jews to defend themselves and so forth? What happened between the banquet in chapter 1 and when Esther becomes queen? Well, here's what happened. Like his father before him, he had a vision of conquering Greece. So he's going to invade Greece, some historians say, with an army of 5 million men. That's debatable, but it's possible. Now, here's his character at the time. Herodotus said his army was so large it was drinking up rivers. That's how he described it. He gets to the Hellespont, the body of water that separates Asia from Europe, and he's going to build a pontoon bridge. And the winds come up and whip the sea into a fury, destroying the bridge. You know what he does? He has the sea cursed and whipped. I don't know how you whip the sea. And then all the poor bridge builders he puts to death because the sea tore up his bridge. But he finally gets across there, and his next humiliation comes. He faces an army of 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, and they hold him off for 3 days. And the only reason he wins that is because a traitor gives him a way around. Later that year in 480 BC, he's defeated at Salamis, and the following year at 479, he's defeated in 2 battles by the Greeks. And we'll talk more about the Greek city-states, but they would band together in times of defense. But he had 300 Spartans holding off perhaps an army of 5 million. And eventually he gets beaten, returns home to Persia, the last Persian to ever cross the Hellespont into Greece again. And so he's a different guy. He's been humbled along the way. And that's why perhaps you see 2 different Xerxes or Ahasueruses in the book of Esther. There's several other rulers after him. I like this guy's name, Artaxerxes Longimanus. Anybody know what Longimanus means? I don't know, Brother Cates used to, huh? Long arms, that's right. So whenever you see a character named Longimanus, it means he's got long arms. It was this Artaxerxes Longimanus was ruling when Ezra and Nehemiah both returned to Palestine. Ezra to restore the law in 457, Nehemiah in 444 BC to rebuild the walls. And of course, Nehemiah served as a governor for 12 years before returning in 432. The last, and there's several others, but the last ruler of the Persian Empire from 335 to 331 BC, Darius III, and he would see his kingdom, the Persian Empire, fall to, Danny, the next one, Alexander. And so we're going to talk about the Greeks. This is the extent of Alexander's empire. These other arrows, I know it's a little confusing, has to do with the division of his kingdom after his death. So we'll talk about that, of course, as well. But let's talk about Greece united for the rest of our time today. Greece did not unite until about the 4th century, obviously when Alexander defeated the Persians, 4th century BC. Early in her history, Greece, and this is of course in the statue of Daniel chapter 2, what parts of the statue represents the Greeks? The belly and thighs of what? Daniel chapter, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Bronze, the belly and thighs of bronze. All right. Early in her history, Greece was inhabited by a people known as the Mycenaeans, but that civilization collapsed in about the 12th century BC, leading to isolation and poverty, but things started opening up by 900. They retained some of the Mycenaean influence, culturally, linguistically, but they were polarized politically. And a lot of that's due to geography. Greece has a lot of fertile farmland, but it's divided by rugged mountain ranges. And so you had the rise of villages that were ethnocentric, and around 700 they began to take on urban characteristics, developing into what became known as city-states. Most of you are familiar with this. They were known individually as a polis, P-O-L-I-S. We see this word used in the New Testament, by the way, politarchs. But that word has been preserved in our modern English in words like what? Polis. Police, metropolitan, words like that. Each city-state would be self-governing and independent of the others. No nationalistic government, no federal government. What a great time to live. And of course, the 2 most prominent that we recall from history are what 2 city-states? Sparta and Athens. Sparta and Athens. Sparta being the greater of the 2 at first. Now, whenever they were, of course, independent of one another, and they even had their own forms of government. Athens became a democracy. Sparta actually had 2 kings and 28 elders ruling council. But whenever there was a threat to that Greek peninsula, even though they were all independent of one another, they would join together for defensive purposes. And a good example of that from secular history would be Homer's Iliad. You remember Troy, and poor Menelaus' wife was stolen by Paris, Helen, and took off with her. And his brother Agamemnon decided he'd get her back, and so it was the face that launched 1,000 ships. Now, I know that Homer's Iliad is not all fact, but most historians believe that it is based in fact. Or rooted in a historical event. And we've already mentioned every time the Persians, either under Darius I, Hystaspes, or later under Xerxes I, every time they tried to cross the Hellespont and invade Greece, they were repelled when these city-states would join together. Prior to the Persian Wars, Sparta was the dominant city, but Athens developed a good navy and then came to the forefront. During the time of the Persian Empire, the Greeks were actually fighting among themselves. They would form various leagues. Various city-states would get together. And for those of you that like history, you probably remember these wars as the Peloponnesian Wars. You might be familiar with that term. There were 2 of them. One from 461 to 446, one from 431 to 404 BC. And the interesting thing is, in these Peloponnesian Wars, when the Greek city-states were fighting each other, Persia, which was, of course, the dominant empire of the time, would have, its fingers and hands kind of in the disputes as well. But all that's going on, and who is sitting just to the north, right there? Anybody read that? Macedonia. Philip of Macedon saw an opportunity to expand his holdings, and so he began invading further south into Greece. His reign began in 359 BC, and by 354 he had gained control of Epirus and Thrace. By 340 Thessaly, and in 338 he defeated Athens and her allies, including Thebes, at the Battle of, I cannot pronounce this, Chaeronea. That united all of Greece except Sparta under the Macedonian banner, with Philip promising to take the fight to the Persians. But Philip was assassinated by a young man named Pausanias, and we'll not get into all why. But it's interesting in history that's debated. It's kind of like the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone, or was it a conspiracy? And some historians believe that his wife, Olympias, and son, Alexander III, had something to do with his death. But Alexander always denied that, and in fact had those responsible put to death. But you should know that Olympias, his mother, had always told him that he was not the son of Philip, but he was the son of who? Yeah, Zeus. And he was descended from Hercules. Therefore, when Alexander went into battle, he would wear a lion headdress. A lion headdress. Who was this Alexander? The writer of 1 Maccabees says this, "And it happened after that Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came out of the land of Kittim," that's kind of an enigmatic reference. Nobody really knows why they would say he came out of Cyprus, although he did receive some Cyprian ships, "had smitten Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, that he reigned in his stead, the first over Greece, and made many wars and won many strongholds, and slew the kings of the earth, and went through to the ends of the earth, and took spoils of many nations, insomuch that the earth was quiet before him. Whereupon he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up, and he gathered a mighty strong host, and ruled over countries, nations, kings, who became tributaries unto him." Juvenal wrote, "One globe seemed all too small for the youthful Alexander. Miserably he chafed at this world's narrow confines as though pent on some rocky islet. Richard Curry, former instructor of the Memphis School of Preaching, would often say that when Alexander had been to India and returned to Babylon, he mourned because there were no more worlds to conquer. I suppose if there may have been some 33-year-olds that achieved more than Alexander, but there's only one that I know of. And he was the God-man, Jesus Christ. But as far as mere humans are concerned, to do what he did by the age of 33 seems almost impossible. He was one of the foremost of Hellenists. What's a Hellenist? What's a Hellenist? You remember in the church in Jerusalem, there was a dispute arose between the Jews, the regular Jewish widows, and the Hellenists. Hellenists were people who promoted and spread the Greek culture. Alexander was trained and educated by Aristotle. And his greatness is testified to by God Himself. Let's go to Daniel chapter 2 and look at a few passages in Daniel. First, you know that the third kingdom is bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. Then turn to chapter 7. 7 verse 6. After this I looked, and this vision of the four beasts, which we'll get to, there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. We'll talk about the 4 heads, of course, but what's the significance of a leopard with 4 wings? Why the symbolism there? Yeah, first of all, a leopard is ferocious, but secondly, a leopard with 4 wings is fast. And Alexander took what he took. I mean, he basically took what he took most of it by the time he was in his early 20s. Let's go to chapter 8. We'll finish with these passages. Pick up next week. Look at verse 5. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, crossing across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. That notable horn is Alexander. Then he came to the ram, the Persians, that had 2 horns, the Medes and Persians, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power, and I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground, trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Look in verses 21. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in his place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And we'll talk about the divided Greek kingdom. One more. Let's look over at chapter 11, verse 3. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Go back up to the verse before it. He shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. So this mighty king is Greek. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. This is Alexander the Third, also known as Alexander the Great. Supposedly his father Philip said to him, O my son, look thee at a kingdom equal to and worthy of thyself, for Macedonia is too little for thee. And I don't know whether Alexander really loosed the Gordian knot or not, and then was proclaimed master of Asia, according to the oracle. But one thing you cannot debate, whether he loosed that knot, is that he was great. And he probably did more for a person his age, like I said, than any person in history other than one. We'll pick up and finish up Alexander And thereupon we'll be ready to move into the divided Greek kingdom, which is extremely important to Daniel. Extremely important to the book of Daniel.